Isaiah Bennett was 52 years old, though the deep lines around his eyes made strangers assume life had aged him faster than time. Every morning before sunrise, he unlocked the side entrance of the downtown maintenance warehouse where he had worked for nearly 18 years. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while forklifts rolled across concrete floors smelling faintly of oil, cold metal, and burnt coffee. Isaiah rarely spoke much during shifts. He simply worked. Quietly. Reliably. The younger men joked loudly during breaks while Isaiah sat alone near his old black truck eating sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and checking text messages from his son. Caleb Bennett. 26 years old. Getting married that afternoon. Isaiah stared at the message longer than necessary. You still coming early, Dad? Need help setting up? A small smile crossed his tired face. Wouldn't miss it, son. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket beside a folded receipt he had carried for years without really knowing why. The edges had softened from time. Hospital billing department. Isaiah rubbed his thumb across the faded print once before folding it again carefully. Then he returned to work. Nobody inside the warehouse knew much about his life. To them, he was just a quiet black man in worn boots who never complained and always volunteered for overtime. They did not know about the second jobs he worked years earlier. The sleepless nights. The old truck he sold and bought back again. The sacrifices folded quietly into ordinary routines. Isaiah preferred it that way. Some things felt smaller once spoken out loud. By late afternoon, rain clouds rolled slowly across the Chicago skyline while Isaiah stood alone inside his small apartment ironing the same charcoal suit he had worn to Caleb's college graduation 6 years earlier. The cuffs were slightly frayed now. Still clean. Still pressed carefully. A father did what he could. The apartment carried the warm scent of coffee gone cold and cedar from the old closet beside the hallway. On the kitchen table sat a wedding gift wrapped in navy paper beside a faded toolbox no one touched anymore. Isaiah adjusted his tie slowly in the mirror while soft piano music drifted from the radio near the sink. Then he noticed the wedding invitation tucked beneath the toolbox lid. Caleb Bennett and Lauren Whitmore request the honor of your presence. Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly. Something felt heavier today. He just did not know why yet. The wedding venue overlooked the lakefront, all glass walls and gold chandeliers glowing against the darkening sky. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway while guests in tailored suits and designer dresses moved through the marble lobby carrying champagne glasses and polished smiles. Isaiah parked farther away near the service entrance beside catering vans and delivery trucks. Habit. He stepped from the old black truck holding the wrapped gift carefully beneath one arm. Rainwater tapped softly against the windshield behind him. Inside the ballroom, Rebecca Bennett stood near the floral arrangement speaking with Lauren's parents. Elegant navy evening dress. Diamond earrings catching chandelier light. Blonde hair pinned neatly above graceful shoulders. She looked exactly like the woman people trusted instantly at charity galas and hospital fundraisers. Beautiful. Polished. Controlled. Most guests would never guess she had spent years sitting alone beneath fluorescent hospital lights fighting through treatments that quietly changed everything about her life. Isaiah saw her before she saw him. He paused near the ballroom entrance, rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat. Rebecca's laughter softened slightly the moment her eyes landed on him across the room. Not anger. Not warmth either. Just distance carefully practiced over many years. The Whitmore family noticed him next. Lauren's father glanced briefly toward Isaiah's worn shoes before offering a polite nod that never quite reached his eyes. Someone near the champagne tower whispered, "That's Caleb's dad." Isaiah noticed. He always noticed. But he simply adjusted his cuff and kept walking calmly toward the back tables where divorced fathers usually sat at weddings like this. No scene. No bitterness. Just dignity. Before we go deeper into what happened that night, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what Caleb discovered before the reception changed the way everyone in that ballroom looked at his father. Across the venue, Rebecca watched Isaiah longer than she intended. Something about him felt different tonight. More tired maybe. Or quieter than usual. Then she noticed the old toolbox resting partially open beneath the gift table beside his wrapped present. Her expression shifted slightly. Because etched into the scratched metal surface was the logo of St. Mary's Oncology Center. The same hospital where she had spent 3 years receiving treatment. And Isaiah had no idea she was staring directly at it. Rebecca Bennett kept glancing toward the toolbox long after the wedding coordinator asked everyone to move into the reception hall. The scratched metal logo resting beneath the gift table pulled at something deep in her memory. St. Mary's Oncology Center. The letters felt strangely personal sitting beside Isaiah's wrapped wedding gift and old truck keys. For a moment, she wondered if he had volunteered there once during her treatments. Or maybe done maintenance work at the hospital years ago. But something about the way he positioned the toolbox close to his chair made it feel less accidental than that. Isaiah noticed her staring almost immediately. He always noticed when Rebecca looked at him differently. Even after 12 years apart. He calmly slid the toolbox farther beneath the table with the toe of his worn dress shoe before anyone else paid attention. Then he straightened his tie again and quietly helped one of the catering staff lift extra chairs near the ballroom entrance. No hesitation. No concern about whether helping looked beneath him. That was the thing people often misunderstood about Isaiah Bennett. They thought his quietness came from weakness when really it came from having survived too much to waste energy proving himself. Across the ballroom, Lauren Whitmore's family gathered near the stage beneath crystal chandeliers and soft piano music. Wealth sat naturally around them. Expensive watches. Tailored tuxedos. Polished confidence. Isaiah remained near the back tables beside the service hallway where staff occasionally rushed past carrying trays of champagne and silverware. Nobody told him directly he did not belong near the front. They did not have to. Some exclusions happened silently. Caleb noticed it before anyone else did. Standing near the dance floor in a black tuxedo, he watched his father sitting alone near the back corner table holding a paper coffee cup instead of champagne. Isaiah looked calm as always. But Caleb had inherited his father's ability to read silence. Something felt wrong. Rebecca noticed it too, though she hated herself slightly for noticing it late. She remembered another ballroom years earlier at Caleb's high school awards banquet. Isaiah had arrived directly from a warehouse shift with grease still faintly trapped beneath his fingernails. One of the private school parents had mistaken him for event staff and handed him an empty glass without looking twice. Isaiah simply took the glass to the catering station and returned quietly to his seat without embarrassing anyone. Rebecca remembered being angry that night. Not at the strangers. At Isaiah. Because he never defended himself loudly enough for people to stop underestimating him. Back then she thought silence meant passivity. Tonight she was no longer sure. The wedding planner dimmed the ballroom lights slightly while guests found their seats. Outside the towering windows, Chicago shimmered beneath rain clouds and city reflections across the lake. Isaiah looked toward Caleb standing beside Lauren near the sweetheart table and allowed himself the smallest smile of the evening. His son looked happy. Truly happy. For Isaiah, that mattered more than where he sat in the room. A waiter passed by offering champagne again. Isaiah declined politely and kept drinking coffee gone lukewarm in the paper cup. Then he noticed Rebecca approaching slowly through the ballroom crowd. Elegant navy gown. Diamond earrings catching chandelier light. Controlled posture hiding exhaustion only someone who once loved her closely would still recognize. Isaiah stood automatically when she reached his table. Old habits. Rebecca glanced briefly toward the toolbox beneath the gift table before looking back at him. "You still keep that thing?" she asked quietly. Isaiah lowered his eyes for half a second. Needed somewhere to store paperwork. Rebecca frowned slightly. From the hospital. Isaiah's hand tightened almost invisibly around the coffee cup before relaxing again. Old stuff. Simple answer. Too simple. Rebecca studied him carefully. Something in his voice carried weight tonight. Before she could ask another question, Caleb suddenly appeared beside the table holding a missing cufflink in one hand and breathing slightly harder than expected. "Dad," he said quickly, "I think I left my vows in your truck." Isaiah reached automatically for the old black truck keys beside the toolbox. "Glove compartment maybe." Caleb nodded and grabbed the keys fast before hurrying toward the parking garage entrance. Isaiah watched him leave calmly. But then he noticed something. The folded hospital receipt still resting halfway visible inside the toolbox lid he forgot to close completely. And Caleb had already taken the keys. Caleb Bennett moved quickly through the underground parking garage beneath the wedding venue, polished dress shoes echoing softly against concrete while rainwater dripped from exposed pipes overhead. Rows of luxury sedans and black SUVs reflected pale fluorescent light across the wet floor, but his father's old truck stood out immediately near the back wall beside the employee parking section. Faded black paint. Rust beginning near the wheel wells. One headlight slightly dimmer than the other. Isaiah Bennett had driven that same truck for almost 15 years. Caleb slowed as he approached it, suddenly remembering late nights as a child falling asleep in the passenger seat while his father drove home from second shifts with cold coffee in the cup holder and work gloves tossed across the dashboard. Back then Caleb never questioned why his father always looked tired. Kids usually assumed sacrifice was just another form of adulthood. He unlocked the truck and leaned inside searching for the folded vows Lauren helped him rewrite 3 times already. The familiar scent hit him immediately. Motor oil. Old paper. Coffee. The quiet smell of his childhood. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while garage lights flickered faintly overhead. Caleb opened the glove compartment expecting envelopes or receipts from the wedding florist. Instead, several thick folders slid partially forward onto the passenger seat. St. Mary's Oncology Center. He frowned automatically. His mother's hospital. Something felt strange immediately. Caleb picked up the top folder carefully. Payment confirmations. Insurance statements. Billing summaries. Hundreds of pages organized neatly with dates highlighted in blue ink. At first he assumed Rebecca had stored old medical paperwork in the truck during the divorce years ago. But then he noticed the name attached to every payment authorization. Isaiah Bennett. Caleb blinked once slowly. Then again. 3 years of monthly payments. Thousands of dollars. Every balance marked paid in full. His breathing changed almost instantly. Quiet at first. Then uneven. Rain continued sliding across the windshield while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Caleb sat motionless inside the truck staring down at papers that suddenly made entire years of his childhood rearrange themselves in his memory. The overtime shifts. The missed vacations. The old truck Isaiah refused to replace even when it broke down twice during winter. The years his father worked weekends at the warehouse after already finishing full shifts during the week. Caleb remembered asking once why they could not move into a bigger apartment after his mother got sick. Isaiah had smiled tiredly and said, "Some things matter more than square footage." Caleb never understood what he meant until now. He flipped through another folder slowly. Automatic payment confirmations every single month. Quiet. Consistent. No missed payments. Then he noticed something else tucked near the back. A printed email from nearly 4 years earlier. Rebecca Bennett's insurance coverage reduced following treatment complications. Caleb stared at the sentence while something cold moved through his chest. His mother never knew. He realized that immediately. Rebecca spent years believing insurance covered everything after the divorce settlement. She used to complain sometimes that Isaiah emotionally disappeared after the marriage ended. That he became distant. Quiet. Hard to read. Caleb believed her for a long time. Standing in the garage beside his father's old truck, he suddenly wondered how many times Isaiah stayed silent simply because silence cost less than explaining sacrifice nobody would understand anyway. A text notification buzzed across Caleb's phone screen from Lauren upstairs. Ceremony starts in 10 minutes. You okay? Caleb looked toward the ballroom elevators across the garage but did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward a smaller folded paper clipped inside the final folder. Handwritten note from the hospital billing office. Mr. Bennett, we know this has become difficult financially. Please contact us if you need to pause future payments. Caleb swallowed hard. His father never paused them. Not once. The child inside him suddenly remembered winter nights when the apartment heat barely worked and Isaiah pretended sleeping in a hoodie was normal. He remembered Christmas gifts getting smaller after Rebecca's treatments began. He remembered his father quietly eating less during dinner some months. The child saw what everyone else missed. Caleb slowly closed the folders, but his hands no longer felt steady. Upstairs, crystal chandeliers glowed while guests waited for speeches and champagne toasts. Down in the parking garage beside an old black truck, Caleb Bennett realized he did not fully know the man who raised him. Caleb Bennett sat alone inside the old truck several minutes longer than he realized. The wedding reception upstairs had already begun shifting into its next phase without him. Somewhere above the concrete ceiling, soft jazz floated through ballroom speakers while crystal glasses touched and guests laughed beneath chandelier light. Down in the parking garage, Caleb stared at the folders resting across his lap like they belonged to someone else's life entirely. Rainwater slid slowly down the windshield in silver streaks, blurring the distant city lights beyond the garage entrance. His father had paid every hospital bill. Every single month. Quietly. For 3 years after the divorce. Caleb leaned back against the worn truck seat and closed his eyes briefly. Suddenly memories returned differently now. Sharper. Sadder. Isaiah coming home after midnight smelling like motor oil and warehouse dust. Falling asleep at the kitchen table beside unpaid utility bills and cold coffee. Selling the fishing boat Grandpa left him and calling it just old junk taking space. Caleb used to think divorce had simply made his father emotionally distant. But now another truth slowly formed beneath the surface. Isaiah had not withdrawn because he stopped caring. He withdrew because survival took everything he had. A car door slammed somewhere nearby in the garage, pulling Caleb back to the present. He quickly gathered the folders together and slid them back into the glove compartment exactly how he found them. Careful. Respectful. His father valued privacy the way some people valued pride. Caleb understood that now too. Before closing the compartment fully, he noticed one last thing tucked behind the paperwork. A folded photograph worn thin at the edges. Caleb hesitated before picking it up. The picture showed Isaiah and Rebecca years earlier outside St. Mary's Oncology Center. Rebecca looked pale beneath a knitted winter hat, but she was smiling softly while Isaiah held a paper cup of coffee in one hand and an umbrella over her head with the other. They looked tired. Human. Clothes in a way Caleb barely remembered anymore. On the back of the photograph, Isaiah had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. As long as she keeps fighting, I will too. Caleb stared at the words until his vision blurred slightly. Then he folded the photograph carefully and placed it back exactly where it belonged. Upstairs, the ballroom glowed gold against the dark Chicago skyline. Guests filled the dance floor while waiters carried silver trays between tables draped in white linen. Rebecca stood near the stage speaking politely with Lauren's mother, but her attention kept drifting toward the ballroom entrance every few seconds. She noticed immediately when Caleb finally returned from the parking garage. Something about him had changed. Not dramatic. Quieter. His eyes carried weight now. The same weight Isaiah carried sometimes when he thought nobody noticed. Caleb crossed the ballroom slowly toward his father's table near the back corner. Isaiah remained seated with one hand around a paper coffee cup gone cold hours earlier. His charcoal suit looked slightly too large beneath the chandelier light, but he sat with the calm posture of a man long accustomed to occupying spaces where nobody expected him to belong. When Caleb stopped beside the table, Isaiah looked up immediately. "Find your vows?" he asked softly. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." His voice sounded different to his own ears. Isaiah noticed that too. Fathers notice things. Caleb lowered himself slowly into the chair beside him while guests nearby laughed over champagne and wedding stories, completely unaware of the silence settling between father and son. Isaiah studied Caleb carefully for a moment before speaking again. "Something wrong?" Caleb looked toward the old toolbox beneath the gift table. Then toward his father's tired hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Grease stains still faintly visible near the knuckles despite the wedding suit. Signs of years spent working quietly while everyone else misunderstood him. Caleb swallowed hard. "Dad," he said slowly, "why didn't Mom ever know?" Isaiah's fingers stopped moving against the paper cup immediately. Not dramatically. Just still. Across the ballroom, Rebecca turned instinctively toward them at the exact same moment, though she had no idea why. Isaiah Bennett did not answer immediately after Caleb asked the question. The ballroom noise around them seemed strangely distant suddenly, softened beneath piano music and quiet conversations drifting across white tablecloths and crystal glasses. Isaiah kept his eyes lowered toward the coffee cup in his hands while his son sat beside him waiting for something deeper than words. For a moment, the older man looked exactly like he had during those warehouse nights years ago. Exhausted. Thoughtful. Carrying more than he ever admitted aloud. Finally Isaiah leaned back slightly in the chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Because your mother already had enough to survive," he said quietly. Caleb stared at him without speaking. Isaiah's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I did not want her feeling like she owed me anything while she was trying to stay alive." The sentence settled heavily between them. Across the ballroom, laughter rose briefly near the dance floor before fading again beneath the clinking of silverware and low jazz music. Nobody else noticed the entire emotional gravity of one family shifting quietly near the back tables. Caleb looked down at his father's hands again. Rough hands. Worn hands. The same hands that fixed broken warehouse equipment all day and somehow still managed to keep hospital payments from stopping for 3 straight years. "Dad," Caleb's voice cracked slightly before he steadied it. "How did you even afford all of that?" Isaiah shrugged once, almost embarrassed by the attention. "Overtime mostly." Caleb shook his head slowly because now he remembered everything differently. The second jobs. The missed birthdays Isaiah arrived late to because of warehouse shifts. The winters they kept the apartment colder than necessary. Even the old truck waiting downstairs in the garage suddenly looked less like stubbornness and more like sacrifice stretched across years. Isaiah noticed the guilt forming across his son's face immediately. "Do not do that," he said softly. Caleb frowned. "Do what?" "Carry this like it was your responsibility." Isaiah's eyes finally lifted toward him. Calm. Steady. "You were a kid." Caleb swallowed hard. He realized then that his father had probably spent most of his life protecting other people from emotional weight they never even saw him carrying. Rebecca approached slowly from across the ballroom before either man noticed her nearby. She had watched their conversation from a distance for several minutes now, unable to explain why the silence between them felt so serious. The chandelier light softened against her navy gown while guests stepped politely aside around her. Even now she moved with polished grace, though exhaustion lingered faintly beneath the makeup and elegant posture. Isaiah saw her first. His expression shifted carefully neutral again almost instantly. Old reflex. Rebecca stopped beside the table and looked between both men. "Everything okay?" Caleb looked at his father before answering. Isaiah gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not yet." Caleb understood immediately. Rebecca noticed the exchange too. What happened? She asked more quietly now. Caleb opened his mouth but hesitated. The folders downstairs still felt too large to suddenly throw into ballroom air beneath wedding music and champagne toasts. Isaiah saved him from the moment the way he always had. Nothing important, he said calmly. Rebecca studied him carefully. She no longer believed that sentence as easily as she used to. Not tonight. Not after seeing the toolbox. Not after noticing how tired he looked beneath the carefully pressed suit. One of Lauren's bridesmaids approached the table then, apologizing softly because the father-son photos were about to begin near the stage. Caleb rose automatically, but before leaving he leaned closer toward Isaiah. "I found the folders," he whispered. Isaiah's entire body went still for half a second. Tiny reaction. Barely visible. But Rebecca saw it immediately from where she stood. Caleb continued softly, "All of them." Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly. Not ashamed. Just tired in a deeper way now. Rebecca looked between both men again, confusion beginning to sharpen beneath her composed expression. "What folders?" she asked quietly. Neither answered her immediately. The wedding photographer called Caleb's name again from across the ballroom while guests turned toward the stage beneath glowing chandeliers and soft camera flashes. Isaiah stood slowly beside the table, smoothing the front of his worn charcoal suit before looking toward his son. "Go take your pictures," he said gently. Caleb hesitated. Then nodded once and walked toward the stage, leaving Isaiah and Rebecca standing alone near the back corner table where old secrets suddenly felt very close to the surface. Rebecca Bennett remained standing beside the table long after Caleb disappeared toward the stage for photographs. Around them, the wedding reception continued moving gracefully beneath soft piano music and chandelier light, but something quieter had shifted beneath the surface now. She could feel it. Isaiah picked up the cold paper coffee cup again mostly to avoid her eyes. Old instinct. Some men learned early that silence protected people better than explanations ever could. Rebecca watched him carefully. The worn charcoal suit. The tiredness around his eyes. The old toolbox partially hidden beneath the gift table. For years she convinced herself she understood exactly who Isaiah Bennett had become after the divorce. Distant. Emotionally unavailable. Too quiet to fight for anything anymore. But tonight that version no longer fit comfortably inside her mind. "What folders?" she asked again softly. Isaiah looked toward the ballroom windows where rain streaked against the Chicago skyline beyond the glass. "Old paperwork," he answered calmly. Rebecca almost laughed at the simplicity of the lie. Almost. Caleb looked like he had seen a ghost. Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly. He was probably overwhelmed. Rebecca folded her arms lightly across her navy dress, studying him the way she used to years ago before life became lawyers, hospital corridors, and careful emotional distance. "You still do that," she murmured. Isaiah frowned slightly. "Do what?" "Pretend things are smaller than they are." The sentence settled quietly between them. Nearby, guests applauded softly as the wedding photographer positioned family members near the floral arch for another round of pictures. Isaiah remained still beside the table while Rebecca noticed something else for the first time that evening. His wedding shoes were badly worn near the soles. Carefully polished. But old. The realization bothered her more than it should have. Isaiah had always taken care of everyone else first. Even during their marriage, he replaced her tires before buying himself a winter coat. She used to think it was simply how blue-collar men handled responsibility. Now she wondered how much of his life had quietly disappeared into sacrifices nobody noticed. "You could have sat closer to the family tables," Rebecca said suddenly. Isaiah gave the faintest shrug. "It is fine back here." She looked around the ballroom. The front tables overflowed with wealthy relatives, business partners, and polished conversation while Isaiah sat alone near the service hallway beside stacked catering trays and coffee stations. Something inside Rebecca tightened unexpectedly. She remembered how often this happened over the years. School fundraisers. Hospital galas. Graduation dinners. Isaiah always drifting toward the edges of rooms while louder people occupied the center. And somehow he never seemed angry about it. Just tired. It should not always be fine, she said quietly before realizing she spoke out loud. Isaiah looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time that evening. Rebecca felt strangely exposed beneath his calm gaze. The ballroom lights softened across her diamond earrings and carefully styled blonde hair, but exhaustion still lingered faintly beneath the polished appearance. Isaiah noticed that too. He always had. "You look healthier," he said gently. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard completely. No bitterness. No hidden accusation after all these years. Just relief. Rebecca glanced away toward the dance floor almost immediately because something about his kindness suddenly felt painful. "The treatments ended almost 4 years ago," she answered quietly. Isaiah nodded once. "I know." The words slipped out naturally before he could stop them. Rebecca turned back toward him sharply. Isaiah realized the mistake immediately. Small. But impossible to take back now. "How would you know that?" she asked softly. Isaiah's fingers tightened around the paper cup again. Across the ballroom, Caleb stood near the photographer beneath bright camera flashes, but his attention kept drifting toward his parents at the back table instead of the wedding portraits. The child inside him still watching carefully. Isaiah looked down at the coffee cup for several long seconds before answering. "Hospital billing cycles changed around that time," he said finally. Rebecca stared at him without speaking. Something about the sentence felt too specific. Too familiar with details nobody should casually know. Then she noticed the folded receipt still partially visible inside the toolbox lid beneath the table. Same hospital logo. Same faded blue lettering. Her expression changed slowly. Confusion first. Then something closer to realization. Isaiah saw it happen in real time and quietly understood that the truth was beginning to move toward the surface whether he wanted it to or not. Rebecca Bennett could not stop looking at the toolbox after Isaiah mentioned hospital billing cycles. The sentence stayed suspended in her mind while ballroom lights shimmered softly across crystal glasses and polished silverware around them. She had spent years inside hospital waiting rooms memorizing billing dates, insurance calls, treatment schedules, and medication renewals. The way Isaiah said it did not sound casual. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Isaiah sensed the shift immediately. He lowered the toolbox lid gently with one hand before anyone else nearby could notice the papers inside. Calm movement. Quiet instinct. Across the ballroom, Caleb watched the entire exchange while the wedding photographer rearranged family members beneath the floral arch. Lauren touched his arm softly. "You okay?" Caleb forced a small nod, but his eyes kept drifting back toward his father and mother standing near the rear tables like two people suddenly separated by years of misunderstanding neither knew how to cross. "I just need a minute," he whispered. Lauren followed his gaze toward Isaiah. Her expression softened slightly. "Your dad looks nervous." Caleb almost laughed at that because Isaiah Bennett never looked nervous. Tired sometimes. Quiet always. But not nervous. Yet tonight something heavier sat behind his eyes. Back near the coffee station, Rebecca moved closer toward Isaiah until the music and ballroom chatter faded into softer background noise. "You were at the hospital more than I knew, weren't you?" she asked quietly. Isaiah kept his attention on the folded napkin beside his coffee cup instead of her face. "Sometimes." Rebecca frowned. The nurses used to mention anonymous payments showing up after insurance delays. Isaiah gave the faintest shrug. "Hospitals work with a lot of people." Rebecca stared at him carefully. There was no arrogance in his posture. No anticipation that she might finally understand something important. If anything, he looked like a man hoping the conversation would disappear before becoming larger than necessary. That hurt her unexpectedly. Years ago, after the divorce papers were finalized, Rebecca convinced herself Isaiah emotionally detached because he stopped caring. He rarely argued. Rarely defended himself. Even when she accused him of shutting her out emotionally during the hardest years of her illness, Isaiah mostly stayed quiet and focused on Caleb. At the time, his silence felt cold. Standing beside him now, she wondered if silence had simply been the only thing holding him together financially, emotionally, physically. "Why did we stop talking to each other like normal people?" she asked softly before she could stop herself. Isaiah finally looked at her then. The ballroom light reflected gently against tired brown eyes that once memorized every detail about her. "We were tired," he answered honestly. Rebecca swallowed hard because no accusation lived inside the sentence. Only sadness. Nearby, guests applauded as Caleb and Lauren finished another set of wedding photographs. Camera flashes briefly illuminated the ballroom while servers refreshed champagne glasses near the head table. Life continued elegantly around them while old truths slowly surfaced beneath quieter conversations. Rebecca glanced again toward the toolbox. "What exactly is in there?" Isaiah smiled faintly without humor. "Mostly receipts and old junk." "Isaiah." Her voice softened on his name in a way it had not for years. Something flickered across his face immediately. Small. Human. Rebecca noticed. So did Caleb, watching from across the ballroom. The child inside him suddenly remembered another night years ago during Rebecca's treatments. He was 14. Isaiah had fallen asleep on the couch still wearing his maintenance uniform after working overnight. A stack of hospital envelopes sat open on the kitchen table beside an unpaid electric bill. Caleb remembered asking if they were in trouble financially. Isaiah smiled tiredly and said, "Families help each other. That is all." Back then Caleb thought he meant relatives. He understood differently now. At the ballroom table, Rebecca slowly lowered herself into the empty chair beside Isaiah. Not because she had answers yet. Because for the first time in years she realized there were entire parts of this man's life she never truly saw. Isaiah noticed her sitting down but said nothing. He simply moved the coffee cup slightly farther from the edge of the table so her dress would not accidentally brush against it. Tiny gesture. Automatic kindness. Rebecca looked down at his rough hands resting beside the paper cup. Hands that quietly carried more than anyone in that ballroom understood. Then she noticed something else. A faint hospital visitor bracelet still tucked deep inside the toolbox corner beneath the receipts. And written across the faded plastic band was her name. Rebecca Bennett stared at the faded hospital bracelet inside the toolbox as if her mind refused to process what her eyes already understood. The plastic band rested beneath old receipts and folded paperwork worn soft from years of being handled carefully. Her name printed across it in faded black letters. Rebecca Ann Bennett. Admission date nearly 4 years earlier. The room around her suddenly felt quieter despite the ballroom music drifting through the chandeliers overhead. Isaiah noticed her expression change immediately. He reached down calmly and closed the toolbox lid the rest of the way before nearby guests could notice anything unusual. But the movement came too late. Rebecca had already seen enough. "Why do you have that?" she asked softly. Isaiah leaned back slightly in the chair, eyes lowering toward the tablecloth instead of her face. He looked tired now in a way deeper than physical exhaustion. Not guilty. Just exposed. Across the ballroom, Caleb stood near the sweetheart table watching his parents from a distance while Lauren spoke with relatives beside him. He could feel something important unfolding quietly beyond the wedding speeches and champagne glasses. The child inside him still listening for truths adults thought they buried successfully. Rebecca kept staring at Isaiah. "You kept my hospital bracelet?" He answered without defensiveness. You were asleep when they almost transferred you to intensive care that night. Rebecca blinked slowly. Memory flickered behind her eyes. Snow outside hospital windows. Machines humming softly in dark rooms. Isaiah sitting beside her bed long after visiting hours ended while pretending not to be scared. Back then she thought they still had time to save the marriage after the treatments ended. Neither of them realized exhaustion could quietly destroy people long before anger ever did. You stayed that night? She whispered. Isaiah nodded once. Most nights. Rebecca's breath caught slightly. She remembered waking up alone so often after treatments. Or at least she thought she was alone. Suddenly scattered memories rearranged themselves differently. Paper coffee cups beside the hospital sink. Extra blankets folded near visitor chairs. The familiar scent of motor oil lingering faintly beneath hospital disinfectant some mornings. Isaiah had been there more than she realized. Much more. A slow song began near the dance floor while guests gathered closer beneath dimmed ballroom lights. Couples moved together quietly across polished marble while city reflections shimmered beyond the glass walls overlooking Chicago. Isaiah and Rebecca remained seated near the back corner table untouched by the celebration around them. Two people sitting inside the remains of years neither fully understood anymore. Why did not you ever tell me? Rebecca asked finally. Isaiah rubbed his thumb slowly against the paper coffee cup before answering. You already felt guilty enough getting sick. Rebecca lowered her eyes instantly because the sentence struck somewhere painfully honest. During treatments she apologized constantly. For medical bills. For missed work. For becoming dependent. She remembered Isaiah always telling her to stop apologizing. Back then she thought he was simply trying to comfort her emotionally. Now she realized he had already decided privately that keeping her alive mattered more than everything else combined. The divorce happened anyway, she said quietly. Isaiah nodded. Yeah. No bitterness. Just truth. Rebecca looked toward him carefully. Were you angry at me? Isaiah thought about the question longer than expected. Finally he answered softly, mostly I was tired. The honesty of it hurt more than blame could have. Across the ballroom, Caleb slowly reached into his tuxedo pocket and touched the folded speech he planned to read later during the reception toast. Suddenly the words inside it felt meaningless. Generic stories. Safe jokes. None of it touched the truth sitting quietly at the back of the ballroom beside an old toolbox and a cold cup of coffee. Near the stage, Lauren noticed the change in him again. Caleb. He looked toward his mother and father one more time before answering softly, I think I need to say something different tonight. Back at the table, Rebecca brushed trembling fingers lightly across the toolbox lid. You paid all those bills after we divorced? Isaiah's eyes stayed lowered. Most of them. Rebecca stared at him in complete silence. Then she noticed something else resting beside the toolbox handle. A folded pawn shop receipt dated 3 years earlier. Item sold, 1978 fishing boat inherited from father. Her expression broke slightly as the final pieces quietly began falling into place. Rebecca Bennett held the pawn shop receipt carefully between trembling fingers while the ballroom lights blurred softly around her. The paper looked ordinary at first glance. Thin. Wrinkled. Faded from years folded inside the toolbox. But she recognized the description immediately. 1978 fishing boat inherited from father. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly because she remembered that boat. Isaiah's father used to take Caleb fishing every summer before he passed away. After the funeral, Isaiah restored the old boat piece by piece during weekends in the apartment parking lot while Caleb handed him tools from a tackle box too big for his small hands. It was the only thing Isaiah refused to sell during the divorce. Or at least that was what Rebecca believed. You sold your father's boat, she whispered. Isaiah looked toward the ballroom windows instead of answering directly. Rain still moved faintly across the glass while Chicago glowed beneath the dark evening sky beyond the lakefront. It was not being used anymore, he said quietly. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief because she suddenly understood the lie hidden inside the calm sentence. Isaiah Bennett did not sell sentimental things casually. Not memories. Not family. Not the few pieces of his father he had left. Across the ballroom, Caleb slowly loosened the folded speech inside his tuxedo pocket while guests gathered near the stage waiting for the wedding toasts. The master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone beneath warm chandelier light while waiters refreshed champagne flutes across the tables. Everything still looked elegant from the outside. Perfect wedding photographs. Perfect floral arrangements. Perfect smiles. But Caleb felt like he was standing inside an entirely different story now. One nobody else in the room knew yet. Lauren touched his arm gently again. You really are not okay. Caleb looked toward her quietly. I think my father spent years protecting all of us from things we never even noticed. Lauren followed his gaze toward Isaiah and Rebecca sitting together near the back table. Her expression softened immediately. Back near the coffee station, Rebecca carefully placed the pawn shop receipt back beside the toolbox. She no longer knew what to say. Every object inside that metal box seemed connected to another sacrifice she never saw while it was happening. Isaiah remained calm beside her, though exhaustion sat heavily behind his eyes now. Why would you do all of this after the divorce? She asked softly. Isaiah gave a faint shrug. You were still Caleb's mother. Rebecca lowered her eyes instantly because the simplicity of the answer hurt more than dramatic explanations ever could. No bitterness. No attempt to gain moral victory years later. Just quiet responsibility carried privately. I thought you stopped caring, she admitted quietly. Isaiah's expression changed slightly then. Not anger. Something sadder. I stopped talking, he corrected gently. That is not the same thing. The sentence settled heavily between them. Rebecca remembered endless nights during her treatments when Isaiah barely slept. He worked double shifts, picked Caleb up from school, sat through hospital appointments, paid bills quietly at the kitchen table after midnight. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion replaced conversation. Then resentment replaced exhaustion. Eventually silence became easier than trying to explain pain neither of them knew how to carry anymore. Rebecca suddenly realized she spent years mistaking his quietness for absence when in reality he had been drowning silently beside her the entire time. Nearby, one of Lauren's wealthy relatives glanced briefly toward Isaiah's back table before whispering something dismissive about the divorced father sitting alone with coffee. Rebecca heard it clearly this time. So did Isaiah. He simply lowered his eyes and folded the hospital receipt back into the toolbox without reacting. No embarrassment. No need to defend himself. That quiet dignity suddenly broke something inside Rebecca she could not fully explain. Caleb saw the moment too from across the ballroom. The way his father absorbed disrespect without becoming cruel in return. The way his mother stared at Isaiah now like she was finally seeing the man beneath years of misunderstanding. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone near the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready for speeches from the family. Soft applause filled the ballroom while guests turned toward the glowing dance floor. Caleb slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded the speech he originally planned to give. Then he looked back toward the old toolbox resting beneath his father's chair. His expression changed quietly after that. Because he already knew he was not going to read the speech everyone expected. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone toward the family speeches. Soft applause rolled through the room while servers quietly cleared dinner plates and refreshed champagne glasses beneath crystal chandeliers. Outside the towering windows, rain still drifted faintly across the Chicago skyline, turning the city lights into blurred reflections against the dark lakefront. Caleb Bennett stood near the stage holding the folded speech in one hand while his other hand remained inside his tuxedo pocket resting against the hospital payment receipt he had taken from the truck. His heartbeat felt strangely loud now. Lauren squeezed his arm gently before stepping back beside her bridesmaids. "Just breathe," she whispered. Caleb nodded once, but his eyes kept drifting toward the back corner table where his father sat beside his mother. Isaiah remained calm as always. Worn charcoal suit. Paper coffee cup still untouched beside the toolbox. Quiet posture of a man trying not to become the center of attention on his own son's wedding day. Rebecca sat beside him now instead of across the ballroom. That alone already felt unusual. Caleb looked at them and realized something painful. For years he believed divorce simply meant love disappearing. Tonight he understood that sometimes love stayed long after people stopped knowing how to survive beside each other. The master of ceremonies smiled warmly toward the crowd. "And now, the groom would like to say a few words." Applause rose again while Caleb stepped toward the microphone beneath soft golden light. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Family members. Friends. Business executives from Lauren's side. Former teachers. Neighbors. People smiling expectantly, waiting for harmless wedding stories and sentimental jokes. Caleb unfolded the speech slowly. Then stopped. The paper suddenly felt dishonest in his hands. He looked toward his father again. Isaiah gave him a small encouraging nod without understanding what was coming. Caleb lowered the prepared speech onto the podium instead. A few guests exchanged curious glances immediately. Rebecca noticed the shift too. Something tightened in her chest before Caleb even spoke. "I had a different speech planned tonight," Caleb said softly into the microphone. The ballroom quieted almost instantly. It was supposed to be funny. Safe. Stories about childhood and marriage advice. He smiled faintly. "But something happened tonight that made me realize I do not actually want to give the safe version anymore." Near the back table, Isaiah's expression changed slightly. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Caleb reached into his tuxedo pocket slowly and unfolded one of the hospital receipts beneath the stage lights. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Across the ballroom, Rebecca stopped breathing for half a second. Isaiah lowered his eyes immediately. "When I was growing up," Caleb continued quietly, "I used to think my dad was just tired all the time because he worked too much." A few soft laughs moved politely through the crowd. Caleb shook his head gently. "Turns out I only understood half the story." The ballroom grew still again. Even the servers near the kitchen entrance paused. Caleb looked directly toward his father now. "Most people in this room know my mother survived a very hard illness years ago." Rebecca stared at him motionless. "What almost nobody knows," Caleb continued, voice roughening slightly, "is that after my parents divorced, my father secretly paid her hospital bills for 3 years. Silence hit the ballroom completely. Sharp. Immediate. No clinking glasses. No whispers. Just stunned stillness beneath chandelier light. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly beside the table while Rebecca slowly turned toward him as if seeing him for the first time in years. Caleb's voice trembled now despite his effort to stay steady. He worked double shifts. Sold things he loved. Stayed quiet while everybody misunderstood him. Several guests exchanged shocked glances across the room. Lauren pressed trembling fingers lightly against her mouth near the sweetheart table. Caleb looked down at the receipt again before speaking one final sentence into the microphone. "My father made sure my mother lived long enough to be here tonight." Somewhere near the front tables, someone quietly set down a champagne glass. Rebecca's eyes filled instantly. Isaiah still had not looked up. The silence after Caleb's words felt almost unreal. Hundreds of people sat beneath crystal chandeliers without moving, as if the entire ballroom had forgotten how sound worked for a moment. Even the soft piano music from the speakers seemed distant now beneath the emotional weight hanging in the air. Caleb stood at the microphone holding the hospital receipt in trembling fingers while his eyes remained fixed on his father near the back tables. Isaiah Bennett still had not looked up. He sat quietly in the same worn charcoal suit with his rough hands folded beside a cold paper coffee cup and an old metal toolbox that suddenly carried more truth than anyone in the room expected to witness tonight. Rebecca stared at him in complete disbelief. Her eyes shimmered beneath the ballroom lights while years of memories rearranged themselves painfully inside her mind. Hospital nights. Exhausted silence. The old truck constantly breaking down. Isaiah skipping meals and pretending he already ate during Caleb's teenage years. She used to think divorce had turned him emotionally distant. Now she understood something far more devastating. He had been quietly carrying her survival on his back while she mistook exhaustion for indifference. A woman near the front table slowly pressed a hand against her chest. Another guest lowered his champagne glass carefully onto the tablecloth without taking his eyes off Isaiah. Even Lauren's wealthy relatives, the same people who barely acknowledged Isaiah earlier, now looked toward him with stunned silence instead of polite dismissal. Caleb swallowed hard at the microphone before continuing. "My father never told anyone." His voice cracked slightly. "Not me. Not my mother. Nobody." Isaiah finally lifted his eyes toward the stage then. Tired brown eyes meeting his son's through chandelier light and quiet emotion. There was no anger there. No embarrassment. Only the weary expression of a man unaccustomed to becoming the center of attention for private sacrifices he never intended to reveal. Caleb looked down briefly at the receipt again. "I spent years thinking my dad stopped caring after the divorce," he admitted softly. Rebecca lowered her face instantly because the sentence mirrored her own guilt too closely. Caleb continued, "But the truth is, he was loving us in ways we never saw." Somewhere in the ballroom, someone quietly sniffled. The emotional atmosphere had changed completely now. No longer elegant. Human. Raw in the quietest way possible. Caleb folded the receipt carefully before looking back toward his father again. "Dad," he said softly into the microphone, "I do not know how to thank you for something like that." Isaiah shook his head almost immediately. Small movement. Humble instinct. Even now he wanted the attention to move away from himself. Rebecca watched him carefully. That gesture broke her heart more than the revelation itself. Because she suddenly realized he truly never expected recognition. Not once. The ballroom remained silent as Caleb stepped away from the microphone slowly. Nobody applauded immediately. The moment felt too sacred for noise. Caleb walked directly toward the back tables instead, still holding the folded receipt in one hand. Guests shifted quietly in their seats as he crossed the ballroom toward his father. Isaiah stood before Caleb reached him. Habit again. Respect again. Caleb stopped in front of him beneath the soft gold chandelier light. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then Caleb wrapped his arms around his father tightly. Isaiah froze in surprise for half a heartbeat before slowly hugging his son back. The ballroom finally exhaled after that. Soft applause began somewhere near the side tables. Then more joined gently. Not loud. Not celebratory. Emotional. Rebecca covered her mouth with trembling fingers as tears finally slipped down her face openly. Isaiah noticed immediately and released Caleb carefully before stepping toward her. The room watched silently as Rebecca stood from her chair looking at the man she divorced 12 years earlier. The same man who quietly sold pieces of his own life so she could survive hers. Isaiah, her voice broke completely on his name. Isaiah lowered his eyes almost instinctively, uncomfortable with public emotion focused toward him. Rebecca shook her head slowly through tears. "Why would you carry all of that alone?" Isaiah looked toward the ballroom windows where rain shimmered faintly against the Chicago skyline. Then back toward her. His answer came softly. Almost too softly for the room to hear. "Because you were already carrying enough." The ballroom remained quiet long after Isaiah's words faded into the soft glow of chandelier light. "Because you were already carrying enough." The sentence settled across the room like something fragile and permanent at the same time. Rebecca Bennet stood motionless in front of him, tears slipping carefully through years of emotional restraint she no longer had strength to maintain. Around them, guests lowered their eyes respectfully or watched in complete silence, suddenly aware they were witnessing something far more human than a wedding speech. Isaiah shifted slightly beneath the attention, uncomfortable with the spotlight now resting on him. He had spent most of his life learning how to survive quietly. Recognition felt foreign to him. Caleb noticed immediately. Even after everything became public, his father still looked like a man trying not to take up too much space in the room. Rebecca slowly wiped beneath her eyes before speaking again. All those years, her voice trembled softly. I thought you stopped loving me. Isaiah lowered his head for a moment. The ballroom lights reflected faintly across the silver strands beginning to show near his temples. No, he answered honestly. I just stopped knowing how to say things when everything became about surviving. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly because deep down she understood exactly what he meant. Illness had consumed everything back then. Appointments. Fear. Bills. Exhaustion. Somewhere inside all of it, they stopped being husband and wife and became two overwhelmed people trying desperately not to collapse in front of their son. She used to blame Isaiah for becoming quiet. Now she realized silence was probably the only thing keeping him from falling apart entirely. Caleb stood nearby beside Lauren, still holding the folded receipt while emotion moved visibly across his face. He looked at his father differently now. Not as the tired warehouse worker people overlooked near the back tables, but as a man who carried impossible weight without demanding praise for it afterward. Lauren reached for Caleb's hand softly. Your father is incredible, she whispered. Caleb nodded once without looking away from Isaiah. Yeah, he said quietly. He always was. I just did not fully see it. Nearby, Lauren's father slowly approached Isaiah with visible hesitation. Earlier that evening he barely acknowledged him beyond polite conversation. Now his posture carried something closer to humility. Mr. Bennet, he said softly, extending his hand carefully, I owe you an apology. Isaiah looked surprised for half a second before shaking the man's hand calmly. No apology necessary. But the older man shook his head. There is. Isaiah offered the same small gracious nod he gave everyone all night. No bitterness. No satisfaction from the shift in treatment. Rebecca watched that too. The room finally respected him openly and somehow he remained exactly the same man he had been before the speech. Quiet. Grounded. Gentle. That realization hurt her in the deepest way because she understood now that dignity was never something Isaiah performed for approval. It was simply who he was when nobody noticed. The wedding band slowly resumed playing soft music near the dance floor while conversation cautiously returned across the ballroom. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. Guests now glanced toward Isaiah with warmth instead of dismissal. Servers stopped by his table more attentively. Several relatives quietly introduced themselves to him properly for the first time all evening. Isaiah accepted every interaction politely while still trying not to become the emotional center of the wedding reception. Rebecca remained beside him through all of it. Not because she suddenly believed old wounds disappeared tonight. They did not. Years still existed between them. Pain still existed too. But for the first time in a very long while, she no longer felt separated from him by misunderstanding. Caleb eventually stepped closer again holding the folded hospital receipt carefully. Dad, he said softly, I hope you know what you did mattered. Isaiah looked at his son for several quiet seconds before answering. Your mother being here tonight matters more. Rebecca covered her mouth again as fresh tears filled her eyes. Isaiah noticed immediately and instinctively reached for a nearby linen napkin, handing it to her without thinking. Same quiet habit. Same automatic care. Rebecca accepted it slowly, their fingers brushing briefly beneath the ballroom lights. Neither spoke after that. They simply stood there together near the old toolbox and cold paper coffee cup while rain shimmered softly against the windows behind them. And for the first time in years, Rebecca no longer felt alone standing beside him. The wedding reception slowly softened into its final hours beneath warm chandelier light and fading piano music. Guests drifted toward the exits carrying wrapped centerpieces and quiet conversations while rain continued tapping gently against the towering ballroom windows overlooking Chicago. Caleb and Lauren shared one last dance near the center of the floor surrounded by family photographs, scattered flower petals, and the lingering emotional atmosphere that still moved quietly through the room after the speech. But Isaiah Bennett had already stepped away from the crowd. He stood alone outside near the parking lot overlooking the lakefront, hands resting inside the pockets of his worn charcoal coat while cool rain mist settled lightly across the pavement around him. The old black truck waited nearby beneath a flickering parking garage light. Same truck. Same tired engine. Same quiet life he would wake up to again tomorrow morning. Isaiah preferred it that way. Inside the ballroom, Rebecca noticed his absence almost immediately. For years she trained herself not to look for him anymore after rooms emptied. Tonight instinct pulled her toward the glass doors before she could stop herself. She stepped outside carefully into the cool night air, heels clicking softly against wet concrete while the sounds of laughter and music faded behind her. Isaiah heard the door open but did not turn around immediately. He already knew it was her. Some people stayed familiar even after years apart. Rebecca stopped beside him beneath the rain-streaked parking lights. For several seconds neither spoke. The city skyline shimmered quietly across the dark lake beyond them while distant traffic moved through wet streets below. Isaiah looked tired again now that the ballroom performance of strength was over. Not weak. Just human. Rebecca studied his face carefully in the soft rain. The lines near his eyes. The silver beginning to show in his beard. The calmness he carried even after having his private sacrifices exposed in front of an entire ballroom full of strangers. "You were going to let me live the rest of my life without ever knowing," she said softly. Isaiah looked toward the city lights instead of answering immediately. "Probably." Rebecca shook her head slowly, almost in disbelief. "Why?" Isaiah let out a quiet breath into the cold night air. "Because surviving was already hard enough for you." The sentence landed gently this time instead of painfully. Rebecca looked down at the wet pavement while tears gathered again despite her effort to stay composed. "I blamed you for so many things." Isaiah gave a faint shrug. "Some of it was fair." Rebecca looked up immediately. "No," her voice broke softly. "No, Isaiah. I thought silence meant you stopped caring." Isaiah finally turned toward her then. Rain glistened faintly across his coat shoulders beneath the parking lights. Sometimes men get quiet because they are trying not to fall apart in front of everybody else. Rebecca covered her mouth briefly because no one had ever explained him to her that honestly before. Not even Isaiah himself. For years she mistook his exhaustion for emotional absence when really he had been carrying fear, bills, overtime shifts, and her survival all at once. The old truck keys rested loosely in Isaiah's hand now. Rebecca noticed how worn they looked. Like everything else he kept too long because somebody else needed him more. "You sold your father's boat for me," she whispered. Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly. "It was just a boat." Rebecca almost laughed through tears because both of them knew that was not true. Nothing inside that toolbox had ever been just anything. The hospital bracelet. The receipts. The photograph. The pawn shop paper folded soft with time. Every object carried pieces of love he never knew how to say aloud. Behind them, the ballroom doors opened again as Caleb stepped outside searching quietly for his parents. He stopped when he saw them standing together near the truck beneath the rain. Not arguing. Not pretending the past disappeared. Just standing honestly beside one another for the first time in years. Caleb smiled faintly to himself and stayed near the doorway instead of interrupting. Some moments belonged only to parents who survived things their children never fully saw. Rebecca slowly reached toward Isaiah's coat sleeve, fingers trembling slightly before resting there gently. Isaiah looked down at her hand but did not move away. The rain continued falling softly around them while wedding lights reflected across the wet pavement beside the old black truck. And standing there beneath the quiet Chicago night, Rebecca finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago.